So our guest speaker today is Carl Fusco, and he's an accomplished marketing research consultant who helps businesses more effectively solve problems by applying research techniques and data-based insights. Carl has a proven record of success with both corporate and agency organizations in research design, methodology, project execution, management, application, and of actionable insights. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Carl Fusco. Welcome, Carl. Good to see you. Thank you for being here.
And good morning to those on the West Coast.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Good afternoon, and I am Carl Fusco. As I said, I've been working in the marketing research industry for about 40 years, and it's always been a challenge to explain what I do for a living to people who are not in marketing research or are not in business. For example, my parents always never understood what I did for a living. It was pretty sad. So I came up with an idea that, what is marketing research? And it's simple. It's just three things: asking the right questions of the right people at the right time. Very simple. But even though it's simple, it's not easy. And we'll go through some examples to show where it's not that easy. So let's talk about asking the right questions first. There are three challenges to asking the right questions. You can ask the wrong questions, or fail to ask the right questions, or you could ask the right questions but in the wrong way. So taking each one of these, asking the wrong questions. The key to asking the right questions and not the wrong questions is matching what you ask to your objectives, making sure that you adhere to the objectives of your research and nothing else. And one of the ways to do this, it sounds counterintuitive, but is to prepare a mock report for your client on what you want to report to them, and then you can fulfill that report or populate that report with the questions you ask. So that keeps you on track in making sure you match your objectives. The other thing is to avoid nice-to-know questions. A lot of times you're working with committees or many different clients, and everyone's got their own agenda and their own questions that they'd like to add to the questionnaire. But you want to keep things short. So make sure you only ask the questions that you need to know. And also, don't ask questions that can't be answered. A lot of times you'll ask a question like, how many boxes of each of the following brands of cereal have you bought in the past year? Well, nobody remembers that. People will give you an answer, but it won't be very accurate. So make sure you ask questions that can be answered. Next, failing to ask the right question or not asking the right question. My favorite example here is New Coke. In 1985, Coca-Cola introduced New Coke, which was a new formula, better tasting formula, and it replaced their flagship brand Coke with this new product. There was an immediate and violent negative consumer reaction. There's protests all over the country. And it was so strong that eventually Coca-Cola relented and relaunched the old formula under the Coke Classic brand. So what happened? Didn't they do any research, you might ask? Well, they did a lot of research, as you might think. But most of the projects they did were blind taste tests of the new formula versus Pepsi. And the new formula won in all the taste tests. It was a slam dunk, they thought. But they failed to ask the question about what people thought of the Coke brand. They failed to ask what people would do if they replaced the current Coke with a new formula. And in that, they really failed. And you can ask questions in the wrong way. So you don't want to ask questions that are leading or loaded. So questions such as, how satisfied are you, or how excellent was the customer service that you received, or how much do you love shopping online? So you're leading people to the right answer, and you can get biased data. Or double-barreled questions where you'll ask something like, how satisfied were you with the courtesy and knowledge of your CSR? Well, which are they answering to, the courtesy or the knowledge? Someone may have had a very knowledgeable CSR that was rude. So how can they answer that question? So you've got to make sure there's only one construct in the question. Or you can have unbalanced scales. If you've got a 5-point scale and 4 of the points are satisfied and 1 point is dissatisfied, you're going to have a bias or a skew to your answers. And you've got to make sure that questions are clear, proper grammar, easy to understand, that you have the proper spelling, and so on. Then you got to ask the right people. Asking the right people is really a question of sampling. So the first thing, again, is to make sure that the population that you're trying to model is matched in the sample, that you've got the right criteria of people in your sample that is a microcosm of the population that you're selecting. Second, you've got to determine the sample size. And the size of the sample is really a balance between the biggest sample that you can have and the budget that you have to spend. Because as we'll see, in order to reduce sampling bias, you want the largest sample you can get. Also, if you've got a lot of subpopulations you want to look at, you've got to have a bigger sample. But you're going to be limited by your budget, of course, and you're also maybe limited by the population size. So if you're in a B2B study and you've got a population of companies that's like 50 companies, well, you're not going to get a sample of 300 out of 50, obviously. Third, you've got to look at sample sources. Today, most sources of sample come from research panels, online research panels. And in selecting a panel provider, you really need to consider a number of things. How big is the panel? What's the structure of the panel? How do they recruit people into the panel? What kind of quality controls do they have? So all of those issues have to be handled to make sure that you're getting a good sample. And then you've got to deal with the error and biases that are inherent in doing research with a sample. Because whenever you use a sample, you introduce some sort of error and bias. And three of the key ones are sampling error, population error, and self-selection error. And sampling error basically is always there. Whenever you take a sample from a population, you're going to have sampling error. Good news is you can measure it and you can mitigate it or minimize it by selecting a larger sample. So the bigger the sample, the smaller your sampling. The other two errors you really can't measure, but you've got to be aware that they could be there. One is population of frame error. It's picking a sample out of the wrong population or the wrong sampling frame. And self-selection or non-response error is just the fact that the people that answer your questions may be different in their behaviors or in their attitudes from the people who don't answer the questions. It's really common in customer sat studies where the people that really are negative about your product or had a bad experience are more likely to respond because they are angry about something. And the people that are very satisfied may skip the questionnaire. So you're going to get some skewed results. And then finally, asking at the right time. So are you ready? Or is it the best time? Or do you have too much time? So first of all, are you ready to do the research? Do you have enough time? My favorite example here is when I was at Bell South. Oops, I went too far. When I was at Bell South, I worked on a project called Simon. It was the first ever smartphone that was developed. Problem was the developers set the product launch date before the product was even finished. It was in concept stage and they already had planned the launch of the product. So the research we did didn't even have a prototype. We used a wooden model that was painted to look like the Simon and showed that to people in focus groups and told them what it might be able to do. So you can imagine that respondents really couldn't assess the functionality of the product, and it was really difficult to read the research. The other question is, is this the best time to do the research? When I was doing a research project for Signature Brands, they had a line of products called Pumpkin Masters, which were pumpkin carving kits. And they wanted to test a new kit concepts. But they had to have the results in April so that they could have it ready for launch in August when people start thinking about carving pumpkins for the fall. The problem we had was you can't find pumpkins in April. So we had to use watermelons and paint them orange to do the video demonstrating how to carve the pumpkins. It worked fine until we got to one part where you had to actually remove the piece of the pumpkin, and instead of the inside of the pumpkin being orange, it was red, because it was watermelon. And then finally, too much time. When I was at Turner Broadcasting, we developed a product called GameTap, which was an online video game service. And we did an extensive amount of research to develop the product and then estimate the demand. And it had a great result. But it took them a lot longer to actually roll the product out. And by the time they launched the product, the specs had changed so much that they were different from what we actually tested. So that even though we had great research, the product was different and it did not perform as well as the research had predicted. So in summary, we want to focus on simplicity. You want to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time, but prepare for complexity. Use your education, your experience, and sometimes a little creativity to execute the projects so that you get the results you need. So in our breakout groups, our discussion question is, in your experience, what are some examples of successes and or failures in asking the right questions of the right people at the right time? Thanks very
Right.
much, and I'll see you in the breakout group.
Great.